Welcome to another one of our webinar series episodes. We're so excited to have Teresa here today. For those of you who have not seen Teresa present before or are new to Teresa Duncan, you are in for a treat. So welcome to our webinar series. I'm Megan Lohman. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of Plan Forward. For those of you unfamiliar with Plan Forward, we are a membership plan software company. We work with practices in just under 40 states across the country. We love what we do, and we love even more bringing this community together to share just different industry experts and key opinion leaders, bringing them together to answer your questions and try to provide really good content for all of you to help you continue doing the best work that you can. So the purpose of this series really is just that. Our team is steeped in the dental industry. Our team has been in it for, gosh, I think a combined 50 or 70 years. So we have lots of relationships. And with that, people like Teresa are lucky enough to be in our network. So one thing that we obviously are talking about all the time is dental insurance. It's something that all of you deal with every day. Patients are asking about it. We have challenges, issues, questions, successes, failures, moving in network, out of network, all the things. So that really is what we're going to be talking about today. And a couple housekeeping items. You are lucky enough to be receiving a handout in your email inbox after this webinar. So don't feel like you have to take feverish notes on every single thing Teresa says. We will be sharing this with you and the handout with you after this webinar. So you'll get the recording and the handout. Secondly, everybody knows these are so much more fun and interesting when there are comments and questions. So because this is a little bit more of a presentation with tons of meat in it, if you think of a question, please throw it in the Q&A, and we will be monitoring that throughout the presentation. But we are going to let Teresa get through her full presentation before we open it up and actually start answering questions, because a lot of it will be covered. So please, as your questions come up, throw it in the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring those. And we're going to save hopefully about 15 minutes at the end to do the Q&A. Let's see, what else? I guess lastly, we just have to introduce our speaker today. So with that, Teresa Duncan is here, as I mentioned. She is a speaker and writer with over 20 years experience in healthcare. Her areas of expertise include revenue protection using proven accounts receivable and insurance methods, and helping doctors and managers establish solid management systems. She's a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Association of Dental Office Management, and she understands the importance of continuing education. She's also an author. She's the author of Moving Your Patients to Yes, Easy Insurance Conversations. And she's a regular contributing author to the ADA's CDT Companion Guide. Teresa is a frequent contributor to multiple dental publications. She was a founding trustee for the Auxiliary Learning Focused Dale Foundation. And she's a member of several organizations, including the National Speakers Association and the National Association of Dental Plans. As you can tell, we have an insurance and dental expert on our hands. She's also been named one of the top 25 women in dentistry by Dental Products Report magazine, and is recognized annually as a leader in consulting by Dentistry Today. She provided consulting assistance in the development of the American Dental Association's guidelines for practice success. She has 2 podcasts, Nobody Told Me That and Chew on This, that provide regular coding and management updates. So if you're a podcaster, definitely tune in there for ongoing meat. And Teresa received her master's degree in healthcare management from Marymount University. So I feel like all of that is relevant and important for us to know. And Teresa, with that, thank you so much for being here. And I will turn it over to you for our presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. Love seeing all of the familiar names. A lot of you are ADOM family to me. And if you're not a member of ADOM, the American Association of Dental Office Management, I highly encourage that you look into that, because it has been almost, I just can't imagine my managerial career and post-dental managerial career without it. Let's move on though, because we have a lot to go over. I have a lot of conversation examples for you. And like she said, please don't feel like you have to write everything down. I'm going to give you the PDF of all of these slides so you have them. The most important thing I want you to take away from this is that this is something that you're going to need to practice with your team over and over again. It's not easy to have really good responses just come off the top of your head. It's not easy. It takes practice, practice, practice. A lot of you who've been doing this a long time, you know exactly what to say, when to say it. But keep in mind that many of your team members don't have that yet. They're still building that confidence level, which is really key when it comes to having good conversations with your patients. If you don't have confidence, it's almost, it's almost like patients can smell that, right? So we want to make sure that we try to stay knowledgeable and trustworthy, and really confidence is how you get there. So this is where, we kind of picture treatment plan presentations and conversations with patients. We think we're going to be like poised and everything's going to be great. And then we end up like just running around like crazy beforehand, because either the treatment changes, maybe we had the perfect treatment plan like put together, and then all of a sudden the doctor's like, wait, you know what, not just a crown on number 14, I think we need endo on that too. And you're like, wait a second, I had this all printed out. I know, I've been there, my dentist used to do this to me all of the time, but it is what it is. But I know what it feels like to have everything ready and then all of a sudden back to the drawing board. And oh, by the way, patients all by themselves in the operatory because we moved on to the next patient. So whenever you get a chance, just get back there and talk to them about it. I totally understand that whole scenario. I've been in there a million times. So let's talk about what you need to get ready for a presentation, a treatment presentation and a financial presentation. And here's something that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, which is your forms. So informed consent, financial arrangements, all of this, we know that we have to have informed consent for the procedures that we provide. So that's pretty common, pretty standard. And honestly, I think once a year, you should probably take a compliance or documentation class so that you stay on top of what your informed consent looks like. Your financial arrangements, anytime that you extend credit past like 3 payments, you're actually in the business of lending, really. And so you do have to have some truth in lending disclosure forms there. But even if you're deciding to have them pay it off in 2 payments, or maybe there's the co-insurance payment at the beginning and then the remainder of it after the insurance comes in, that all has to be agreed upon. So financial arrangements are really important. The referral forms, if you're in a general practice, of course, you're in the middle of presenting and then all of a sudden you're thinking, okay, I know that they wanted a perio referral. Then you have to get up and go get the form. So have all of that ready for you in the operatories. And then what if you need to go third-party financing? I would rather you not be the bank, and that's pretty much standard. I don't want you to have to extend credit to your patients. I'd rather you go through a third-party financing company and let them assume the risk and you get paid. That's my preference anyways, when it comes to forms and finances. And as part of a thank you for attending today's session, in the follow-up email, you're going to get a checklist I created, and I use this with offices. It's called Set the Tone. And what we do basically is go over everything you need. And this is really handy for someone who is trying to build their confidence. And my hope is, as you go along, you won't really need to look at it all that often because it'll be second nature, but we need to get to that point, right? So hopefully this is very helpful for you. So make sure to check out the follow-up email with the PDF of the slides, and you'll get this checklist as well. All right, so let's get into patient conversations. And I know that sometimes it's not fun, especially when you have somebody on the schedule that you see them in the morning huddle, you see their name on the schedule and you're like, oh, it's just not going to be fun. I know, but we got to put on our smile. We have to be friendly. We have to be, helpful. And if you've taken any of my insurance classes, you know that I really believe it's important that we become the benefits whisperer. We're the ones who are going to translate the benefits to the patient because they have no clue what they're looking at and what they're reading. And on that checklist that I showed, some of the most common things like waiting periods, do you have good x-rays? All of that is on that checklist, because even once you get done presenting the treatment, right, you've got to make sure in the back of your head and back of your mind that you've got everything you need to file the claims when they're there. And it's the best time to do it. So that's part of it, because we need to make sure that we're pretty much closing all the loops on their treatment. My goal, of course, is to make sure everything is said as clear as possible and as confidently as possible. And if that confidence comes across really well, the patients are going to trust you when it comes to, when you say, I estimate it will be this, they will trust that more the second and third time around. If you get it wildly different, I think we need to make sure that we apologize for that. And we say, we really thought it was going to be this way and it ended up going this way. We have to own that. Doesn't mean that I'm apologizing for it. It's just, well, your insurance carrier zigged when I thought it was going to zag, but I'm not going to ignore it. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen, because I want to maintain that ability for them to be able to trust us, to look at the benefits and try to translate it as best as we can. Patients really hate surprises. And that is the one thing that's pretty universal. Patients don't want to hear the word oops in the operatory, and they don't want to get a surprise bill. That's our version of oops, is sending them a bill later that they didn't expect. No one likes that. I don't like it. I'm sure you don't like it. So that is the goal, is to make sure that we're as clear as possible with their financial obligation. And hopefully we can do our part with estimating. And I know that's a whole different class. Sometimes it's harder than it looks. And unfortunately, it's just gotten more difficult as the years have gone on. But I digress. Some of the phrases that I find to be very, very helpful are included here. And so I want to see if you could start sprinkling this into your conversations. Mrs. Jones, we're seeing that secondary insurance doesn't cover as much as it used to. Mrs. Jones, we have found that many patients who use their insurance don't realize the limitations that are on their plans. I mean, things like that. So I've worked with many plans like this, Mrs. Jones, and I'm really confident telling you that your deductible is going to apply to this particular procedure. I mean, you can see how you can sprinkle all of this in there. Now, that last bullet point I put in there because I know one thing is that patients do not want to feel like they're the only patients in the office that need this particular thing. So, for example, say you need to extend payments, maybe you need to go into doing third-party financing. Patients don't want to feel like they're the ones you have to kind of make all these allowances for, right? They feel already, usually people are are very aware of the fact that they don't have the cash on hand, and they're trying to tell you in a nice way, look, I don't think I can afford this. So my go-to is to make them feel like this is something that happens all the time, which in reality it is. So Mrs. Jones, we have a lot of patients who seek out the third-party financing that we offer because it helps them to get the dentistry done in a quicker fashion. So I'm going to say things like that so that they know this is pretty common, oh, well, okay, well, I guess if a lot of patients do it, it must be something they do all the time. You're not lying. It's absolutely the truth. It's just that we got to get them to that point where they realize that that's an option for them. All right, so conversation best practices. So here's my ground rules for talking to patients, and then we'll get into some more examples. Always find privacy. HIPAA is a thing. We don't want to have somebody in an operatory and we start talking about how their mouth is all blown out and we need to do implants here, endo here, and then their neighbor from up the street is in the operatory next door. They hear everything. And if you're in a small town, you know how that goes. Gossip just goes crazy, right? So always find a nice, quiet place. And that's why consultation rooms are really popular, because you can take them away from the operatory and have a very comfortable area where they can sit and be comfortable. I mean, the dental chair is comfortable, don't get me wrong, but it is much easier to talk to somebody, I believe, when they're right across from you on a desk. And then also in these consultation areas, I can have all sorts of stuff up on my screen. I can have tons of study models that I can just slide across the desk to them. And it's just, to me, it's a little bit more relaxed. Now, some of you are in areas where space is a premium, so you may not have a consultation room. Perhaps your desk area where you work could be a mini consultation desk. at any rate, just make sure that you keep it, private, so that, and it's, we owe that to the patient too, and try to keep your voices low. The other reason for that is that we don't want to get them excited about this kind of stuff. It's a serious conversation. And sometimes you'll have patients in the back that are like, why does this cost so much? And they start to, their voices start to rise. We definitely don't want to have this be a very stressful conversation for them. So we try to make that as comfortable as possible. Keeping your voice steady, keeping your voice calm is a good way to do that. And this is basic communication. When somebody escalates their tone of voice, we tend to escalate right along with them. Think of any time you've had to discipline your teenage son or your daughter, you know what I'm talking about, right? So, but you can't do that. You have to resist that urge to kind of escalate along with them. And it's okay to pick up the conversation later. If the patient is having a hard time understanding, or they keep saying, I need to think about it, that's okay. What I'm going to do though is follow up with them. I'm going to ask for permission to follow up with them in maybe a week, maybe a couple days. You will decide on your own what the situation is, but it's okay to let them go. Don't feel like you didn't close that, that treatment plan if they leave without some sort of commitment. A no now, you hear this all the time, a no now is not a no later, because when it comes to the sales cycle, which is sort of a rough word for really a rough term for what we're talking about, sometimes people need to hear it over and over again. And a good example of this is somebody who has a perio issue. Maybe they need the scaling and root plating and they just keep putting it off over and over again. At some point, they're going to get it, because maybe the hygienist is going to just have that look in her eye one day and just say, we've been talking about this a long time. This has really gotten to the point where you have to do something about it. Patients sometimes just need to hear things over and over again. That's just human nature, I think. Until they decide that it's important enough to pursue, they're going to find reasons to not get it done. And that's what we do. That's part of what the training is for today. I always document too with direct quotes and follow-up steps. So anytime, say, for example, that patient wanted to put off the scaling and root planing, I'm going to document that in the notes. Patient would like to put off this treatment because of, and I'm going to give the reason. Either they didn't feel like this is the right time, they don't believe that they need it, maybe they're saving money for a wedding, whatever the reason is, that's actually going to go into the chart. And that's going to be very helpful for me the next time, or maybe the treatment coordinator after me, the next time, to be able to say, okay, I know last time you were worried about, the cost of your daughter's wedding and pictures were beautiful, all that kind of stuff. Now we need to get back to focus on getting you healthy again. So that's very, very helpful to have in the records so that we can refer back to it. And follow-up steps. If you tell the patient you're going to follow up in 2 days, my hope is not only is that going to get documented, but in 2 days, you're going to have a follow-up documentation that indicates that you did try to reach them and whether or not that was successful. So one other thing that the manager can do, you as the manager could do, is to work this muscle. So this is something that, it's kind of hard to do this like once a year. If you have a once a year meeting, it's really hard to get that across to your team. So I would, at every team meeting, do 1 to 2 patient situations that either your team found challenging or you found challenging. And a good way to start this off is to pick one patient in particular that maybe has not scheduled or is very resistant to scheduling. Perhaps somebody scheduled that you all were very surprised, like you couldn't believe it. They walk up front and you're like, I can't believe you're scheduling. You don't want to say it, obviously. But it feels like forever we've been talking about this tooth number 9, and now all of a sudden he or she wants to schedule. Have conversations about that. What do you think was the turning point? What would you have said? What have you said that you don't think has landed? And maybe give your best case scenarios. This is a really good activity to have in your monthly meetings. And I wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't wait and do this very sporadically, because people really need to have this top of mind when they're talking to patients so that this muscle gets better every time they use it. So one cautionary tale, and I would talk very frankly to the clinical team members about this, because I find that they tend to be the ones that do this. not by any fault of their own. They just tend to have habits that they go back to. And until we can break them out of these habits, then they're going to continue to do that. And some admin team members too, we need to get them to this point. We have to remember that patients can be either insurance driven or insurance friendly. And I want to always be insurance friendly, but not insurance driven. And unfortunately, I've worked with quite a lot of offices that tend to have rules in place, such as we take 4 bite weeks per year on a patient or as frequently as insurance allows. That's not real. That's not the way. It's not the way. Patients should have radiographs prescribed as needed. It should be a prescription that the doctor puts into the notes, and it should be based on the patient's risk factors and, why you need the radiograph. It shouldn't be because you're going to get paid for it. And that really is the difference between being insurance friendly and insurance driven. One other thing that we say a lot is we use the word maximum rather than benefit. And maximum implies a stopping point, which is why I don't like using it at all. When patients hear that they met their maximum, they tend to go, wait a second, hold on. And they peel back a little bit. What I want you to say is you've met your yearly benefits. We've exhausted your yearly benefits. It's better than maximum. Maximum just has this negative connotation to it. I also don't like when the clinical team members are extremely aware of the insurance. That sometimes it's impossible. You just know who has which plan because they're going to talk about it in the clinical area. However, in my years prior, when I used to do in-office consulting all of the time, I would hear doctors in December that would say, let's do number 14 today, and then in 2 weeks, it'll be next year, we can do number 15 at the same time. Ideally, at number 15 after your benefits kick in again. I would guess most of those dentists that would say that would love to do 14 and 15 together because clinically that's the better call. You get a better fit, better occlusion. It's just easier on the patient and the dentist. But here you realize that the dentist is treating the plan, not necessarily the patient. And that's what I'm talking about. They tend to have it in the forefront when it really should be pushed to the back of mind. The insurance coordinator, the treatment coordinator should be the one that's going to talk that over with the patient. I don't think that should be something the doctor should make a clinical decision on because it sets the wrong precedents. All right. And then, of course, keep in mind that patient financing is absolutely a great tool to help with your treatment plan presentations. I almost feel like that's the last backup, my blanket state, my safety blanket, because of course I'm going to ask the patient to pay for everything at the time of service. That's of course my preference. I'd rather them pay for it before they even come in for their appointment, of course, but I know that sometimes doesn't happen. But if I can at least offer third-party financing, I know that I'm not going to extend myself and deplete cash flow that could be coming in to help us run the practice. So let's go over some common conversations with patients. These are the most common questions that I get in classes. And when I was presenting treatment, I would get these all of the time. So hopefully these answer a lot of the most common questions that you're going to have. And again, share this with your team so they get used to it as well. So always, especially the clinical team members, they just have to get really good with sending the patient either to you up front or answering as benignly as possible, because I don't want my clinical team members to promise that something's going to be covered, but they don't realize that there's maybe a waiting period for a restorative. Maybe that implant's going to be covered, but not until their 3rd year of employment. That's the stuff that I have to keep track of. So the question though that they're always going to get as soon as you put any kind of treatment plan in front of them, how much does my insurance cover? Well, that's where I'm going to say your plan has a yearly benefit of $1,500, but I want you to take a look. I don't want you to look at this big number down here at the bottom. And what I actually do is I take my hand and I say, look, here's the big number, and then I cover it up. And I'll say, because we're not going to do it all at one time. If we were to sit you down and do one whole day of dentistry on you, then yes, that's the number. But because we're going to be doing it in phases, I need you to focus on these other numbers. And hopefully your treatment plan is split out like that, where it would be set up in appointments. And what I'm going to do is let them know the benefit for the year that you've got. Your carrier will kick in $1,500. And so the rest of it will be, and then whatever it is for that first and second phase. The chances are your patient is not going to plow through and get everything done right away on a $20,000 treatment plan. It's going to go in stages. Just really, because if you get to that point, it's going to be a staged operation, right? There's going to be tons and tons of stuff done. Even if you did all on fours, you still have a ton of time that you'd have to stretch this out, enabling the patient to make payments on it. But I'm not going to have them focus on that big number at the bottom, which is what their eyes are always drawn there. So I'm always going to make sure that I bring their attention back to me. Hey, let's look at this up here. This is the first two phases that we're going to work with. Let's go up here. And then when somebody is, so your clinical team should be comfortable saying, this is something that I know just enough to be dangerous about, make a joke about it, go up front. And Jean up front knows her stuff. She's the one, she helps patients all day long with this kind of thing. I would make sure that the clinical team instills that kind of confidence into the patient so that when they go up front, they're expecting Jean to be the rock star insurance whisperer that she is. What I would also say too is that if we're unsure, we still need to double check on something, let the patient know, we're going to look into this for you. We'll give you a call afterwards. I mean, you have to follow up on that kind of stuff. Here is the confidence builder, though. The more you say this, the more the patient is going to understand that you know your stuff. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with your benefits, but we do this all the time. We do this all day, every day. And what we found is that we're pretty good with our estimates. Sometimes there's a random clause or some cost containment measure that's going to throw us for a loop, but our job is to find that before it becomes a big issue. And I'm going to tell them that this is basically what I do all day, every day. Now, I just want to give you a pearl here. One thing that I usually do when I give them that big treatment plan, and then I'll cover the number. I let them know, yes, they have a yearly benefit of whatever it is. But I always ask them too, do you have the ability to put money aside pre-tax through your job? Do you have a health savings account or a flexible spending account? A lot of times patients don't realize that they can use this for dental care. And this is almost like finding another $1,000, $2,000, depending on what the benefit is, that the patient doesn't realize that they can use that. So especially in the beginning of the year, if you can talk to the patient about putting that money aside and putting it aside tax-free and using it in your office, a lot of times they are extremely happy about this and they really do see that you're helping them out. Like I said, many patients don't realize that they can use this for it. They kind of think that it's only for eyeglasses, and hearing aids and things like that, or prescription medications that are really expensive. They don't think to apply it to dentistry. And so I want to make sure that you jog their memory so they know that. All right, so what happens if they get something in the mail? Say you send in that pre-treatment estimate and something comes back and says, my insurance, and they call you and they say, my insurance says I can't have those crowns done. All right, so we know what happened here. And this is where I need to be real clear with you guys so you can explain this really clearly to them, because this is also something that I hear in a lot of offices. The insurance did not say that you can't do it. The insurance said that they're not going to pay for it. The insurance said they're not going to provide benefits for it. That is not that the insurance says that you can't do it. So here's what I see all the time in Facebook forums, and I'll hear people in my classes that will say, but we can't see them until XXX. That's not really what's happening. You can see them and your doctor can do whatever he or she wants to clinically. It's their call. The fact is that some benefits just aren't going to get paid out for it. For example, Delta has this clause where you do scaling and root plating, right? But the perio maintenance, if it's performed within 90 days of the last quadrant that you did, they consider that to be part of the procedure. What happens if you want to see that patient before 90 days? What happens if you don't think it's controlled and you want to get that patient in and do an evaluation? Well, you can still do that. See how that works. The insurance is saying that they're just not going to pay you for it. They're going to roll that up. You could still do that. Here's the issue is that I find a lot of times offices will say to the patient, well, we'll do 2 quads today and 2 quads in a week because that's what your insurance covers. What you're doing is sending the message to the patient that the insurance is the one calling the shots. And I've talked to lots of insurance people, people that work for the companies and the carriers, and they say this all the time. We just tell you what is going to be paid. We don't tell you how to do the dentistry. And I understand that when you say you're not going to pay something, it actually sounds like, okay, you shouldn't do it. But that's our perception of it. And if our perception of it is that we need to shut it down because it's not going to be covered, what do you think the patients are going to pick up on? And so we need to be better about translating that to the patient. So here's some conversation for you. And again, this is what you're going to practice over and over again, because this is not going to come out pretty the first time you say it. It's just not. I was not born saying flowery things all of the time. I had to make sure that I was good at it. I had to try it over and over again. And some clunkers rolled out of my mouth at really awful times, but it helps you get to where you get to a point where you're comfortable with it. So I know it seems that way, Mrs. Jones, that they're saying that you can't have it done, but what they're actually saying is they're just not going to pay for it if we were to do it in this manner. But, Dr. Smith is really adamant that if we wait too long to have this procedure done, he or she really thinks that it's going to impact your ability to smile, chew, eat, whatever. So I'm basically letting them know, I know it sounds like that. I know the wording makes it sound like that, but they're saying they're not going to pay out benefits for it. It doesn't mean that you can't have the procedure done. So then the next logical question is, well, I don't want to, or the next comment, I don't know if it's logical, but it happens, right? The next comment is going to be, well, I don't want to get it done if it's not going to be covered. So then, you know what? The patient has the right to say that to you. The patient has the right to request that. So I'll say, okay, well, it sounds like you want to go with your plan design. Mrs. Jones, Dr. Smith is really concerned that you're going to put this off longer and it's going to be even more expensive down the road. There's all sorts of things you can say to let them know that, okay, they can make that decision, but this is going to be the consequences of it. And it's okay for them to choose that. That's their care, right? But it's our job to let them know what happens if they do decide to go that route. I always let them know too that they're not the only ones in this boat. So finances are an issue for many of our patients. Jean's really good up front and helping patients figure that out. So, and I'm always talking about Jean because Jean is the girl that took my managerial position after I left. She was my right hand for years, and she's just running that office like crazy now. It's great. So I'm just going to use her name over and over again because I'm kind of used to saying it now. It's nice to be able to refer to somebody else as the head honcho, actually. It takes a little bit of the stress off. All right. So what about the patients that come from offices where they didn't have a lot of financial guidelines? Maybe their insurance guidelines were just really, really loose. And you always have that one doctor in town that just didn't accept co-payments or they never sent a bill. There's always that one, right? You perhaps have taken over a practice that has these kinds of very lax guidelines in place. And now you're the one who ends up looking like the big bad because you're now trying to put all these rules in place. That's okay. It's all right. It is what it is. Not every patient's going to love and adore you. Some of them have to, grin and bear it for a little bit. But what we do need to do is make sure that the patients understand that this is our way of doing business. So I'm going to be very firm, but I'm going to be super friendly, but super firm because these are the guidelines that we have in place because what you learned, many of you learned during COVID, if you were in dentistry during the lockdowns, is that when you don't have cash flow coming in, you can't pay people, you can't make improvements, you can't do very much of anything. And so if you are waiting on a patient's co-payment or co-insurance amount, and you bill the insurance they paid, and now you're sending a statement and you're waiting, that's money in the bank that we could be using to pay our employees, to pay down debt, whatever the reason is. So I actually have been using COVID. I like to blame the accountant for a lot of things. And so I know a couple dental CPAs and they know I do this and it's all right. I'm not going to stop because it's just so convenient. I like to blame the accountant. What I'll say is, our accountant is asking us to do things differently. Our accountant recommends that we do it this way and we need to follow his or her recommendations. But COVID has been a really good excuse for a lot of things. You know, COVID made us really take a good look at everything, and we realized that we needed to change our guidelines. Many of you took a look at things during COVID and decided to go out of network. You guys decided to start taking deposits for care. You started collecting at the time of service rather than sending that statement afterwards. So many of you realized that you needed to tighten things up. So don't be afraid to use COVID as an excuse. You know, we had to make a lot of changes since COVID happened, and this is one of them. We found that we had to tighten up our financial guidelines. So I know that last time you weren't asked to pay your coinsurance amount. So this time, maybe we can split the difference and have you pay half of it today and then half of it when you come back for your cementation of the crown. So you can always do a little bit of wiggle room, but at least let them know that going forward, this is how it's going to be. And you know what? It's your office. You got to make sure you get this straight, right? So what about these patients can sometimes drive you crazy, right? I'll just pay for it after insurance. Like I'll just send you a check afterwards. That's what you end up hearing a lot because they're used to doing that. And maybe the office, you know, they got trained that way. So here's my verbal skills around this. I wish we could still do it that way, but unfortunately we just can't. You can see in my second line, I absolutely blame the accountant and COVID in the same line. So it's kind of fun. I got to combine those two. Our accountant showed us how that didn't really work for us during the pandemic. And so we had to make many changes. And one of them was the financial arrangements. We needed to tighten that up. We were always going to give you our best estimate of what your cost is going to be. So there's no surprises. And I also tell them, look, I don't like surprises either. And I know that that's important to people because they need to plan their finances. We try to get it as close as possible. If something comes back really funky, like on the retreatment estimate, for example, or the EOB comes back in, Mrs. Jones, if something comes back really funky and it doesn't look at all like what we talked to you about, I'm going to investigate it first, and then I'm going to pick up the phone and give you a call. And I'm guessing if you're going to say that, you're actually going to do it. You should do it. And I think most really conscientious managers and insurance coordinators, when they get something wildly wrong, an estimate wildly wrong, you're going to call on it anyways because you're trying to figure out what the heck, what happened here. And so that's how we learn too. But I know you guys are going to call and find out what happened. And then the natural customer service progression is to let the patient know what happened. And then you can decide from there, you know, how long you want to split out the payments. Or I know some doctors like to forgive some of the coinsurance if it was truly the office's mistake. But I have a hard time with that because I really just don't like writing off anything. That's kind of that's something that just makes me nervous about that. And then I'm always going to say, you know, if they put up a big fight and they're not going to want to pay the bill and they were a longtime customer, I'm going to give a little bit. You know, I'm going to take things into consideration. Why don't I go ahead and text you a link to pay, or I'll email you a link to pay, or I'll email you information about our third party financer, and you can look into that. But what we're going to need to do, Mrs. Jones, is go ahead and have this taken care of when you come in for your next appointment. So they can get out without paying now. The rare bird can leave my office without paying, very, very rarely. But you can bet that I'm going to make sure that I get that payment at the next appointment. And I'm going to try to get it before they even go back into the operatory. Like I'm going to say things like, you know what, let's go ahead and take care of that right now. You don't want to talk to me when you're numb. You're going to want to get out of here as soon as possible. Let's go ahead and take care of that right now. And patients just like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? And if they put up a fight, you got to think about that. What's going to happen so you can prepare for that. That conversation, that's not even a nice, pleasant patient conversation. That's somebody right there that is likely going to try to avoid paying their portion. You know, it came up in one of my classes last week. I was up in Chile, North Dakota, and we were talking about this in one of the classes that, you know, if a patient skips out and doesn't pay you, you guys should realize that that's theft, and you can file a police report on that. And it's not something you necessarily want to do if you're in a town of like 1,000 because everybody knows everybody. But for the most part, when people skip out, they're committing a crime. They're committing a crime against you, and it's disrespectful. And quite frankly, you're not going to see them again. I mean, if they skip with intention, you're not going to see him again. So you need to take the proper steps to protect your office, and filing a police report is something I would absolutely do. I would guess it's not just you that they're doing this to. So I wanted to give you some of the more, I guess, advanced patient conversations that are a little bit more tricky. I threw in a clinical one here because perio has been such a big issue lately. I know that many carriers are really scrutinizing this whole category of procedures. And so that means that you're having to have a lot more explanations to patients of why things aren't being covered or why they paid for this when it was clearly this in your mind. So lots and lots of conversations on that. Another team exercise I would have is to compile those. Like if you get a lot of pushback from patients on perio claims, put those together, bring it up in a team meeting, because perhaps there's something clinical that you could say. Maybe the clinical team can give you some feedback and some verbiage to use when you're talking to the patient about why irrigation was needed or why they chose to use a laser to disinfect. Patients are aware of that, right? We gave them the treatment plan, but when they actually have to pay for it, they start to question why they needed to have things done. And sometimes the clinical team can really draw that picture a lot better than I can. So as it pertains to insurance, what I have found with perio claims is, of course, they're getting scrutinized more. But I also see that it's getting harder and harder to get things paid. And they're starting to move a lot of perio categories. It used to be paid under basic, 80% standard, right? I'm starting to see perio moving into the major type 3 categories, which means lower, means 50, 60% coverage. Because it's just, it's really utilized. I mean, imagine that. Lots of people have perio disease. So it's a utilized category, right? So what I like to do is say, Mrs. Jones, what we find is a lot of plans are paying less and less for this type of treatment, but Dr. Jones doesn't want to wait that long for it. He's really concerned that it's progressing. I understand that here's something that we said all the time in our practices, because we actually partnered with a fertility clinic. And there are lots of studies out there that have links, now not causes, because that's different. You can't say it causes it because that's not true. But there are links that suggest that perio disease, the presence of periodontal disease, has an effect on low birth weight. Well, when you have and also the ability to conceive, when you have a woman who is wanting to conceive and the child is just that much more precious to them, that's something they're going to pay attention to. There's links to prostate cancer. There's links to heart disease. There's links to all around inflammation, arthritis. Perio disease is just straight up inflammation, right? So it makes sense that there's links to all of these other issues. So don't be afraid to call in your clinical bros to help you out with that kind of terminology. So if the patient is kind of poo-pooing it, that's something that I really think we need to be a lot firmer about. I think a lot of times we kind of back off if a patient doesn't necessarily want to get the treatment done. We don't go clinical on them, which is, I guess, the term I want you to do. I want you to go all clinical on them. Let them know that this doesn't just stay in the mouth. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox here because that's something that I feel very, very strongly about. The one thing I do say with perio and with claims that I think I'm going to have trouble with is I enroll the patient into helping me. So what I'll tell them is, Sally, what I have found with these types of claims is that they're getting harder and harder to get paid. So I will do everything I can to obtain the benefits for it. If I have to call you, it's because I have reached the end of my rope. It's because I've exhausted my limit. And so I'm going to need you at that point to help me out by either calling the carrier or the HR department, but I'm going to do everything I can before it reaches that point. So what I've done then is put that seed into Sally's mind that if I do call her, that means that I really need help because I've done everything that I can. And Sally's going to be more inclined to help me out because I already sort of pre-programmed her for this. One treatment plan tip is when you do present scaling and root planing as part of the next phase, I always put 2 to 3 4910s on there for 2 reasons. One is to remind me that I need to talk about it with them if the doctor didn't already, that after scaling and root planing or osteosurgery, that it's no longer a preventive visit, that it's a disease maintenance visit. And that's what the 4910 is. The second reason is that I want them to see that it's likely going to be covered at 80% because the computer is going to spit that out. Now, I know that many plans are covering 4910s at 100%. That's phenomenal. So depending on what the plan says, I'm going to put that on there. It is going to eat at their max, though, their yearly benefit. And so that's where I want to make sure that I address that. And putting it on the treatment plan is almost a reminder for me to discuss it with them. So, I really hate that conversation that I used to have with patients where they would come up and say, why are you charging me so much for this? It's no different than the cleaning I used to get. And if that's the case, if you hear that from a patient, I need you to go back to the clinical team and have a real honest conversation with them, really honest conversation with them, because a 4910 should not feel like a 1110. And if it does, then there's a disconnect on what's going on in the hygiene chair. And there needs to be a conversation about that, because if it is exactly the same, you're going to have no way to support your billing for a 4910 in the patient's eyes. And you know what, if I were a patient, I would feel this way also. Okay, so secondary insurance. I know many of you are like, yay, secondary insurance. And no, you're not. Secondary insurance stinks. It really does. It stinks to deal with. I spend so much time talking about secondary insurance nowadays that I'm starting to have nightmares about it. I'm sure some of you do too. So what the problem is with secondary insurance is that when patients have more than one plan, they think everything is covered. That is a real problem, because you and I know that just because they have secondary doesn't mean that everything's covered. If you have two poorly paying plans, they're not going to combine to make one incredible plan. They're going to be poorly paying twice. That's just what that means, right? So we have to have some good conversations around that in the beginning when we're presenting treatment, so that it almost like talking about sending up the bat signal for the patient's help, I'm going to seed this in their mind as well. So, Sally, we found that when we estimate secondary insurance, it's just as difficult to get an estimate from them as it is for the first one. What we have found, Sally, is that just because you have two plans doesn't mean that everything's going to be covered. I know in the old days it used to be like that. I miss those days, but unfortunately, what we have now with dental benefits is that you'll get a lot paid, but usually not everything. In my experience, we have found what I see. Do you see all these terms that I'm using? And none of those are lies, because every single one of you has seen this. Unless you started yesterday, every single one of you have seen this. So we do our best. That middle one, I should have put it last here, but really I always close up with, we do our best to give you our estimate. We do our best to give you the closest estimate that we can. If it comes back funky, then I'm going to call you. I'm going to talk to you about it ahead of time so that you're aware. I don't want you to have any surprises. And I use terms like that. If it comes out funky, if it comes out wildly different, I'll use terms like that because the patient, that's my natural way of talking. So the patient understands that and it comes out to be very organic, right? So I'm not trying to blow any smoke up, patient's dress. Oh God, what a terrible way to say that, right? Like, I guess you can't say that kind of stuff anymore. Not trying to blow anything up, right? What I'm trying to do is be super, super transparent and bring that clarity to the conversation. And that's just good for all of us. So I'm going to end by talking about one of the more difficult patient conversations to have, although it's deeply satisfying when you have it. What happens if you have a patient that needs to hit the road, just needs to go? And I have heard, giving the management classes that I have over the years I've been speaking, I have heard tons of stories of abuse by patients to staff and to doctors. And I'm not sure if you're aware of the recent happenings down in Tyler, Texas, but there was a very sad story out of there last month. I'm sorry, I think it was February, it might have been February or March, end of February or March, that a patient was very upset, came in and ended up going out to his car and getting his firearm and shot and killed two of the dentists that were there. So it's a terrible story. But the one thing that I got out of a lot of the clippings is that they had known this patient had been a problem. They had anticipated issues with this patient. And so we need to be really strong about caring for our team, caring for our office, and caring for our patients. And if you have any kind of patient that comes in that makes you uncomfortable, the team uncomfortable, we need to be strong enough to get rid of that patient and let them find another dental home. If an employee feels uncomfortable, they need to go. If there's any kind of swearing or threatening, that was something that we never, ever put up with. You know what, we would love to have business, but we're not going to take that kind of business. And that was something that we were very, very strong about. And what happens to the patient that just doesn't want to go to by your office guidelines? What happens? This is not necessarily the abusive patient. This is more the patient that said you're telling them they need to pay for their coinsurance at the time of service, and they just completely disregard you and walk out. They do it over and over again. That's not the kind of patient that you want. So don't be afraid to get rid of patients who are not good for your team, who are toxic to your team, and that you just, you know what, the longer you do this job, managers and doctors, the longer you do this job, you have these gut feelings about certain patients. You just know things are going to go wrong with them, and you need to listen to that and you need to trust it. So I know it's not quite a patient conversation to move them to yes, unless it's heck yes, get out of the office. But I do feel very strongly that we need to protect our teams and our practices more and more from these types of patients. And so I think that's definitely worth a conversation with your team. As Megan indicated, I absolutely have 2 podcasts, love podcasting. The Chew on This is more on current events and kind of some fun. We have some fun with it. And then Nobody Told Me That is my management and business course podcast, which goes a little bit more in depth. I've taken a little bit of a hiatus, but we're getting right back into it. But a couple months, we kind of slowed down a little bit and enjoyed the flowers for a little bit, but now we're getting ready to get back into it. I do have a book called Moving Your Patients to Yes, as she said. And I know many of you that have gone to ADOM or have come to see me speak, you already have a copy of it. And I appreciate that you guys, I've gotten some really good feedback on it, but it is available to you. And you certainly, if you come to ADOM, I'm sure there'll be a free copy given away there as well. And that's in September. I believe Plan Forward will be at the ADOM conference. And so you'll need to stop by, and see them at the booth. Find me on social media. I'm around. I would love to connect with you. I post some informational stuff, but I love my memes. So I do post my memes. And then Megan, I'm going to turn it back over to you with a huge thanks. And then I know you have some current events you want to talk about.
We do. Before we dive into next steps, if it's okay, we have 2 questions that came
Sure.
in.
Yeah, sure.
So one was regarding documentation and really putting notes in the chart so everybody's on the same page and you can follow up. So Angie says, where is the best place to put the notes regarding the treatment plan discussion?
So with treatment plans, and I just killed my screen sharing. So let me just go back to that so you have it. When it comes to collections protocol, this is the question that I get a lot. Where do I put that? Well, so if it's about collections, then definitely not in the clinical notes. So that actually should stay out of it. But if a patient says something to you that indicates acceptance or rejection of treatment or delaying of treatment, it's a clinical note. And so I would actually have you go in and make a clinical note in the patient's chart. And I know some offices will actually make any admin notes, they'll make it a red color or a bright color so that the doctor goes right to it, because it's not your typical clinical note. So say patient calls up and says, I'm going to put this off because I have a trip to Aruba coming up. I mean, lucky patient, right? So that's what I'm going to put exactly in the notes. Patient canceled scaling and root planing appointment because, and in quotes, I have a trip to Aruba coming up, end quotes, and that's my clinical note. So honestly, if it ever goes to court, what that shows is that the patient prioritized something over care. And then it also helps my doctor when they're looking back into the chart and saying, what's going on here? I'm talking to them about care and they just seem to blow me off. What is going on here? Seeing something like that really lets your doctor understand the mind of the patient that's in the chair. Good question.
And there's one more regarding perio. Almost all insurances do not pay for D4341 for 4 quads of SRP per date of service. But clinically, if a patient needs it and the office has to do SRP for 4 quads, do they say to the patient that insurance will pay for 2 and the rest you have to pay for out of pocket? So kind of how do you actually articulate that?
Sure,
when
sure.
with the 4 quads being on the one data service?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Sally, it looks like we need to do, doctors recommending doing all 4 quads at one time, or I would say full mouth. I wouldn't say 4 quads. I would do it in the full mouth at one time. Many insurances have this cost containment measure, and I don't say clause, I say cost containment measure. Many insurance companies have this cost containment measure where they'll only pay for one side at a time. Unfortunately, the studies show that it's actually better to do all 4 at one time. And I'll tell you why. And this is exactly what I would say to the patient because it makes sense. Once we clean one side of your mouth, Sally, by the time you drive home, the bugs that are still on the other side are going to already be reinfecting the really clean side. So it really doesn't make any sense to have you wait to get this done. So the reason that's in their plan is it's a cost containment measure. Many plans have it, but Dr. Smith really feels that, you need to have it all done at one time. I would also say that there are, and this is not what I would say to the patient, but just say to the person who asked the question, there are many times that you can get 4 quads paid in one day. I've been pretty successful if there's been mitigating circumstances. For example, perhaps the patient's doctor doesn't want to stop the blood thinning medication or any of the other medications that they're on. They don't think it's healthy for them to stop for an extended period of time. So it makes sense to do it. Perhaps the patient has anxiety issues and they only want to do it all at one time. Perhaps the patient has mobility issues. Perhaps there's a caregiver situation where the caregiver is not available all of the time. Perhaps, I learned this in North Dakota, for crying out loud. Perhaps driving to the appointment was a hardship. These people drive 180 miles. They don't think it's anything. It's crazy. It's amazing to me. So perhaps it's a hardship for them to reach your office. So if there's mitigating circumstances, especially if the medical professional feels that it's in the patient's best interest, I've been pretty successful at getting that paid. But yeah, prep the patient. Use the terms cost containment measure, because as your person who asked the question indicated, there's no clinical reason to do it 2 quads at a time. There's just no clinical reason for it.
Great answer. I was the financial coordinator in our practice, and I wrote down as you were talking about that, just like you said, we are the insurance whisperer, right? Like even though it's their plan, they expect the insurance coordinator or the office person to know how their insurance is going to pay and to prepare them for the out of pocket. So I wanted to challenge you a little bit on that, because if you do clinically what's best and don't necessarily proactively tell them that, oh, if we split this up into 2 dates, the insurance coverage would be different. And then the EOB comes back and it shows this large out of pocket. Does that make the insurance coordinator or the office person look maybe less competent or less savvy because they could have worked the system a little bit better?
Yeah, they could have. And I understand what you're saying. I would have let them know ahead of time that, I wouldn't have said, and that's the thing. I wouldn't have said, let's just go ahead and push this through and we'll see how it gets paid. I would always, if I know, I'm going to let them know here's the issue. And same thing, like, let's just take gingivectomies. A lot of times gingivectomies are not covered when done in conjunction with the crown. And so I'll say that to the patient. Your plan has something that's very common, which is a cost containment measure for this particular procedure code. You probably are going to be footing the bill on this because that's just something that they seem to not want to cover. And that way, if it comes back covered, great, that's awesome. But I'm already warning them. Yeah, I think there are many times where we feel like we could have warned them, but honestly, sometimes you didn't know. Like if you're a new insurance coordinator and you didn't know some of the stuff I was talking about, you do now. And that's where you would start. So, don't beat yourself up over it. Things happen. Yeah, it stinks. Sometimes the patient gets really mad, but these are all learning experiences. If it was an honest mistake, it was an honest mistake.
Yep. Same person says some insurances, if all 4 quads are done on the same day, 2 are paid fully and the rest are downgraded.
Yeah.
Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. They'll downgrade either, I'm not quite sure why, but they would downgrade it either to 4342s on the other side, or they'll give you the benefit of a 1110 on the other side, which is weird because 1110 is a full mouth code, but it's plan design is not something I do. And all I have to do is just translate it to the patient. Yeah, I've seen some funky stuff, man.
It's getting funkier.
Yeah, no kidding.
So regarding pre-authorizations, is there a dollar amount you suggest doing pre-auths?
So there's pre-treatment estimates and pre-authorization. So pre-treatment estimates are what we tend to send in, meaning we want to know how much is going to be covered. A pre-authorization is something that's actually required. And so we need to make sure we get the terminology correct. That being said, there are some small union plans or just small plans that are concerned with cost that absolutely require pre-authorizations for certain procedures like TMD treatment or sleep apnea, for example. But if it's just a pre-treatment estimate and you're just sending it in so that you can get better at making these estimates, I don't have a dollar amount in mind. If you want to send in a pre-treatment estimate for everything because you're just not sure, I have no issue with that. That's how you learn. But I don't want that to become a crutch for you where you're sending it in because the patient's pushing back and you're like, okay, well, when it comes back, I'll just call and schedule and then you're basically kicking the can down the road. In that situation, I'm not a fan of it. But if you're newer or it's a plan you're totally unfamiliar with, or you just have that feeling, go ahead and send in the pre-treatment estimate for whatever you'd like. Another advantage of that, so the dollar amount really isn't a big deal to me, only because if you have a plan that you suspect is a low paying plan, you could send in a pre-treatment estimate for, say, a prophy, and say your prophy fee is $100, just for example. If their EOB comes back and they pay 100% of $70, that tells you that their UCR is low, their usual customary reasonable rates are low. And that tells me that the rest of the estimates that I give them are going to be off because they're paying off a much lower UCR. So if you weren't sure what I'm talking about with that, listen to this again on replay and it'll make more sense, because I just kind of I think the more experienced office managers probably got that, but newer ones, you're going to have to listen to that again. You just want to know who's a low paying plan and who's not, and pre-treatment estimates help with that.
So do you find that, so if that's 30% off of UCR for that pro fee, but you're really kind of thinking, what's it going to pay, restorative?
Yeah.
Do you think that translates a 30% write-off, or would
Absolutely.
it be bigger?
Absolutely. Okay. So I would, like say my crowns are covered at 50% according to this plan. So I know it's 50% off of this already low UCR. So I might bump that down to 35% or 40%. Yeah. I would give myself a buffer. And, if it comes back differently, great. But I've never seen a low paying UCR plan that suddenly became a higher paying plan down the road. It always seems to follow that pattern.
I guess what I'm saying, to be more specific, if it's about 30% off of the UCR for preventive care, do you think the UCR would be about 30% off of your standard fee for restorative care? So for a $1,000 crown, you could estimate that their 100% would be $700.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Another question, for the new and removed codes, I have one insurance company that still wants the removed D8060 instead of the new D8070 for ortho. It's hard to keep track. She said, should I still send in the 8070 code? So
I would let them know that according to HIPAA, you have to use the most current code set available. It's a HIPAA requirement. Them requiring an older deactivated code, they're not being compliant with HIPAA, and that's not okay, especially because we're out of January. Typically, there's a little bit of grace given to insurance companies who haven't quite updated their software, but it's been a while since I've seen something like that. So for them asking you for an old code, they're actually not compliant with HIPAA. So I would push back and say, according to HIPAA regulations, we are required to use the most common code set. This code is inactivated. This is the appropriate code. Please process benefits.
Yep.
I might even CC the patient from that.
Yeah. Great answer. That's the end of our questions. Oh, one more. Do you recommend uploading participating plan fee schedules into our practice management system?
Yes, I do. If you're participating, I want you to submit your full fees all the time. So set up your claim form so that you submit full fees. And if you use fee schedules in the computer, you'll get much more accurate treatment plan estimations so that you're not sitting there with a calculator and crossing out numbers and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm a fan of putting in the fee schedules so that you can use those. for really good computer generated estimates. I know that there's a school of thought out there that, if you use these fee schedules, it actually shows, it gets the patient comfortable to lower fees, but they're going to see the difference in fees when they get the EOB. So I'm not as concerned about that as I know some other people are.
We still have some questions that are really more specific to these specific practices. Are you okay, Teresa, hanging out for another few minutes?
A couple more. I want to be,
okay. Conscientious.
Yeah. So maybe one or two more. And then
okay.
I can always take the extras offline.
Okay, perfect. Well, you know how to reach Teresa. Also, real quick, these are our next few webinars upcoming. Our next one is May 11th with the fabulous Colleen Huff. And then we have a two-part series on Profit First. So Barb Stackhouse, she is a hygienist by trade, but she most recently co-authored Profit First for Dentists and has just had phenomenal success with that. So she's going to talk about that over a two-part series this summer. So be sure in your email that you receive as a follow-up, the registration links will be in there. Okay, so one other question. We have just gone out of network with United Healthcare. They are applying the same in-network fee schedule to all the patients with out-of-network benefits fee service. Is that normal?
They should be processing your claims as out of network. Yeah, if they're processing them as in network, but letting you charge the patient. If the patient portion is still will bring you to your full fees, then I don't see a problem with that. It's just that they're doing a poor job of processing them. But if they're processing them as in network and saying that you can't collect this, what you'll need to do is make note of every one of those EOBs and resubmit them, and talk to a customer service rep, get a person who's a manager and get a fax number and a reference number. And you'll need to resubmit all of those claims on a spreadsheet because they need all the claim ID numbers, and they're going to need to go back and reprocess every single one of them.
Okay. They say they are processing them as out of network, but the fee schedule that they are using is in network, and patient owes a lot more.
Okay.
Used to pay a large amount toward the claim.
As long as the EOB says that the patient can pay, what they're doing is those particular plans are not going to pay on your UCR, on your full fee. Those particular plans are just paying on that agreed upon fee schedule. And you find that with some plans where that's the fee schedule across the board for those plans. And that's okay, as long as the EOB says that you can bill the patient for the extra amount. If for some reason your fees are going to them with the lower amount, that you need to check the claim and make sure format and make sure it's not sending in the fee schedule that's attached to that. But it sounds like they're just processing it so that they can pay a lower amount. And that's what the plan pays for.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, there are lots of thank yous coming through. This was amazing. Teresa, you're amazing. All of your universe here is cheering you on. So Teresa, with that, there were a couple more. If you have questions, please follow up directly with Teresa. Thank you all so much for being here. Teresa, thank you for all of the great content and your willingness to share your wisdom with us today. Hope everyone has a fantastic day.